The posting letter arrived on a Tuesday. I read it, set it down, made coffee, came back, read it again, and accepted that my career had just been politely buried with full honors. Rim Station Ocho, Veldaren Consulate, Cultural Liaison. I sat in my chair for a long time after that. My name is Marcus Vale. I am 34 years old. I speak 4 languages, 2 of them alien. I have navigated trade disputes between species that communicate through color and species that communicate through silence. I am, by any reasonable measure, not a man who gets posted to a rim station that most conclave members cannot locate on a standard star chart. And yet, Rim Station Ocho turned out to be exactly as advertised. It was a rusting platform at the outer edge of map space, staffed by a skeleton crew of 3 humans and 1 coffee machine that beeped disapprovingly at anyone who selected decaf. The station smelled like recycled air and mild regret. My quarters had a window facing a quadrant so empty it looked like the universe had forgotten to finish decorating. I unpacked in 11 minutes. That included reorganizing the cabinet twice. The Veldaren delegation arrived the next morning. I had read the briefing files on the transport over. The Veldarens were old, not old the way humans measure old, but old the way mountains are old, the way a language is old when it has words for things that no longer exist. They were tall, pale in the way that light is pale, and bioluminescent in thin lines that ran along their necks and forearms. In dim light, they glowed faintly, like something underwater. They were also dying. Not in the immediate sense. No war, no disease, no catastrophe. Just a quiet, generational collapse of their reproductive biology, some cascade in their genetics that 2 centuries of Veldaren medicine had not been able to reverse. Their birth rate had been declining for 40 years. Their population had been declining for 20. They had reached the point where the math was no longer a debate. The briefing file called it a biological attrition event. I called it what it was, the slow end of a people, written in their own cells. The delegation was led by Crown Princess Saravale. I was told to meet her at Docking Bay 3. I arrived 2 minutes early, which is my standard operating procedure, and spent those 2 minutes reviewing my notes on formal Veldaren greeting protocol. There were 14 steps. I had memorized 12 of them on the transport. I was comfortable with 12. She came through the docking bay doors alone. No escort, which broke 3 of her own delegation's protocols. She was tall, they were all tall, but it was not her height that I noticed first. It was her stillness. She moved through the station corridor the way a fault line sits under a city, perfectly composed, nothing showing. The kind of stillness that takes enormous work to maintain. She wore the formal silver and white of the Veldaren royal house. At her collarbone, a small emblem I recognized from the briefing files. Kethara. The word translated roughly as the unfruitful. It was a designation, official, ceremonial, permanent. In Veldaren society, it meant she had been medically classified as unable to contribute to the continuation of her people. It meant she had been, in the most formal and elaborate way possible, removed from the future. She was 31 years old, and her civilization had already written her out of it. I completed 13 of the 14 greeting steps. The 14th required a specific wrist position I had clearly memorized incorrectly, because she looked at my hand with an expression I could not read. I said in my very best High Veldaren, "I apologize for the wrist." She looked at me. Her bioluminescence, faint gold along her neck, did something subtle, something I did not have the vocabulary for yet. She said in perfect English, "I speak your language. You do not need to attempt mine." I was trying to show respect. "You showed effort, that is not the same thing." She tilted her head slightly. "But it is rarer." That was how it started. I gave her the station tour. There was not much to tour. She asked questions in the way someone asks questions when they already know the answers and are testing the quality of your honesty. I answered honestly because I did not see the point of doing otherwise. She asked about my posting. I told her it was not what I had expected. She said, "You were sent here because you are considered expendable." I said, "I prefer strategically flexible." "Your preference does not change the fact." "No," I said, "it doesn't." She looked at me for a moment. Then she asked the question that I would replay in my memory for a very long time after. "Your species is not dying, your numbers grow, your reach expands." She paused. "What do you do when something is ending, when you can see the end and you cannot stop it?" She was not asking about humans in the abstract. I knew that. I had read the briefing files. I understood the weight of the Cathara emblem at her collarbone and what it cost her to wear it every day in front of her own people. I also knew that I had come to this posting specifically to stop thinking about endings, about a funeral in November, about the brother I had not been on the same planet to bury, about the empty apartment in Chicago that was the exact shape of a life I had not finished grieving. And so I said the thing I said, not because it was diplomatic, and not because it was wise, but because I was standing on a half-dead station at the edge of map space, and I was tired of careful answers. "We make terrible decisions," I said, "and somehow that fixes it." She stared at me. I counted 11 seconds. She said nothing. Her bioluminescence did the thing again, that dimming and brightening I had no word for yet. Then she turned and walked back toward the delegation quarters, composed and upright and glowing faintly in the recycled air of a station that smelled like mild regret. I stood in the corridor for a moment after she left. The coffee machine beeped at me from the commissary down the hall, disapproving as always. I had meant it as a deflection, the kind of half-joke that fills silence without claiming anything, the kind of answer you give when you cannot give the real one. I did not know, standing there in that corridor, that I had just said the truest thing I would say in the next year. I did not know what I had started. I went back to my quarters and reorganized the cabinet a third time and did not think about Chicago at all. I was excellent at not thinking about Chicago. I had been practicing for 11 months. The thing about being a cultural liaison is that the job description sounds important, and the actual work is often something close to academic babysitting. I attended meetings I was not cleared to speak at. I filed reports about meetings I had attended. I translated menus. I explained, on 4 separate occasions, why humans shake hands as a greeting, which seemed to disturb the junior members of the Veldaren delegation in a way I found mildly entertaining. But Saravale kept asking me questions. Not in any official capacity. Not in the briefing rooms or the formal exchange sessions that the senior delegation members organized with the exhausted precision of people who had been performing diplomacy so long it had become indistinguishable from theater. She would find me in the commissary, or in the narrow observation corridor on sublevel 2 where you could see the star field without the port window grid cutting across it, and she would ask questions. About Earth, about humans, about the particular brand of irrational stubbornness that led our species to do things like settle on planets with no atmosphere and call it progress. I answered every question as honestly as I could, which, for the record, was not always flattering to us. She asked why humans eat so many things that are technically bad for them. I said, because good and bad are less important to us than interesting. She considered that for a moment. That explains a great deal about your foreign policy. I said, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about our foreign policy. She did the dimming and brightening thing again. I was starting to understand from context that it was something like amusement, but not quite. Closer to the recognition of something unexpected, like finding an answer in a place you weren't looking. I had started doing my own research by then. Not official research, personal research. The kind you do at 2 in the morning when you cannot sleep and your brain refuses to stay in its lane. I pulled every xenobiology cross-reference the station database had on Veldarin reproductive biology, which was not much, because most of it was above my clearance level. But the academic literature was public. 2 centuries of papers. 2 centuries of very smart people arriving at the same conclusion through different routes. The Veldarin reproductive process required a specific hormonal resonance between compatible partners. It was not just biological. It was chemical in a very precise way. Their bonding chemistry had evolved over millennia into something that only worked between Veldarins, and even then only in certain combinations, and the combinations had been narrowing. The collapse was not a disease. It was evolution quietly retiring a system it had overspecified. On a footnote of a footnote, buried in a cross-species compatibility survey that had been published 12 years ago and cited twice, I found something. A hormonal compound, present in 3 other conclave species, structurally distinct from the Veldarin resonance compound, but sharing enough of the same base architecture that the survey author, a xenobiologist from a university I had never heard of, had flagged it as theoretically worth investigating. The survey had also run a broad sweep of known species. Humans were on the list. Not flagged, not highlighted, not followed up on. Just there in a column of data with a number next to our species designation that I was not qualified to interpret. I mentioned it to Dr. Priya Osai the next morning. She was the station's xenobiologist, the only one, a sharp, precise woman from Bangalore who had been posted to Acha because she had annoyed someone important and handled it with remarkable grace. She was eating a bowl of noodles when I brought it up. She read the paper on my datapad, read the specific entry, made a small, thoughtful sound and said, "Interesting." Then she went back to her noodles. "That's it," I said, "interesting." "It's theoretically interesting," she said. "Practically, it's nowhere near relevant. The resonance required is incredibly specific. Finding a structural cousin in human biology doesn't mean it functions the same way. It would be like saying 2 instruments are related because they both have strings. But they could play together. In theory, in the same way that you could, in theory, build a rocket out of compressed cheese." She looked up at me. "Theoretically possible, practically absurd, and no one is going to fund the experiment." I thought about that, then I said, "Has anyone actually looked?" She said, "No, because it's absurd." "Sure," I said, "but has anyone looked?" She gave me the look that I would come to recognize as her professional way of saying that I was asking a question nobody else had thought to ask, and she was not sure whether to be impressed or concerned. "File the note," she said finally. "I'll look at it when I have time." She did not have time for 3 weeks. I had time that same afternoon, sitting in the observation corridor watching the star field, when Saravale found me again. She sat not in the formal Veldarin posture she maintained in every official setting, upright and precise as a statement of intent, but in something looser, with her long legs angled toward the view. She looked at the stars for a while without speaking. Then she asked why humans touch each other so much. It was such an abrupt question that I almost laughed. I asked what she meant. "In greeting," she said, "in comfort, in passing, you touch each other constantly. For your species it appears to be a form of punctuation." I thought about it. "It's connection," I said. "Physical contact makes the connection real, like it closes the circuit. Without it something feels incomplete." She was quiet for a moment. In Veldarin culture I had learned touch carried enormous social weight. It was deliberate, formal, rare. Touch from a Kethara was uncharted territory that the social protocols had simply never needed to address, because the assumption had always been that a Kethara would not be touched, would not reach for connection, would not have occasion to. She said, "And when you grieve, is touch a part of that?" I looked at the star field. The light out there was old. Some of those stars had been dead for 1,000 years and were only now arriving in our eyes. Yes, I said, more than anything. She said, we do not touch in grief. We are alone in it. It is considered a private act. I said, that sounds exhausting. She said, it is the only way I have ever done it. Neither of us said anything else for a while. Then the airlock at the end of the corridor gave a low mechanical warning sound, a malfunction in the seal pressure sensor, a minor thing that happened every few days. Saravale stood to leave through that end of the corridor, toward the delegation quarters. I grabbed her arm. Not a decision, pure reflex. The seal malfunctions were minor, but they were not harmless, and she was standing 2 meters from it, and my body moved before my brain finished the sentence. The room, the 2 junior delegation members who had appeared in the doorway at precisely the wrong moment, went completely still. I let go immediately. I said, I am so sorry. The seal, there's a fault in the pressure sensor, and I should have warned you before. I wasn't trying to. Marcus. Her voice was perfectly level. Yes. I know why you did it. I waited. She looked at her arm, where my hand had been, and then looked at me. Her bioluminescence was doing something I had no vocabulary for at all, something I had not seen it do before. Your instinct, she said, was to prevent my death. Yes. We do not have a protocol for that. I said, because it was the only thing I had. Cool. We will just have to invent one. She looked at me for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not the careful diplomatic composure, not the formal stillness. Something underneath it, something that had been sitting underneath it for a while. She left without another word. I stood in the corridor for a moment. The seal alarm beeped once and went quiet. I pulled up the maintenance report on my datapad and logged the fault as I always did. I did not log what had just happened in the corridor. There was no form for it. There was no form for most of what was happening, and I was a man who understood forms, and that fact was beginning to concern me in a way I did not entirely know how to reorganize. The Conclave Medical Summit on Veldaran fertility had been scheduled for 2 months. It was the 4th such summit in 8 years. Everyone attending knew it would reach the same conclusions as the previous 3, thorough, rigorous, and functionally useless. But the conclave had a deep institutional commitment to documentation, and so the summit proceeded. It was held aboard a conclave diplomatic cruiser, neutral territory, parked in the space between nothing and nothing. 12 species, 47 researchers, 200 years of data, and me in the back row with a translation earpiece and a datapad I had been specifically told was for note-taking only. I had also been told not to speak unless spoken to. This was a standard instruction whenever the conclave put me in a room with people who mattered. I had a gift for asking the wrong question at the right moment, and senior diplomats had learned to preemptively suppress this. Saravale sat at the ceremonial table at the front of the room. Not at the main table where the researchers presented, not alongside the senior Veldaran Medical Council, at a smaller table to the left, elevated slightly, positioned where everyone could see her, the Kethara seat, the formal acknowledgement that the last of the direct bloodline was here to witness the proceedings. She sat upright. She sat still. She watched the presentations with an expression I had come to recognize as the one she used when she was making absolutely certain that nothing showed. I watched her watching the presentations, and I thought about a corridor and a star field and an old light arriving from a dead source, and I turned back to my datapad and took notes. The presentations were dense. I caught perhaps half of each one through the translation earpiece, which had a slight lag that turned complex scientific language into something that arrived already partially dissolved. But I was following the data summaries. The slide decks were available in translated format on the conference system, and I was reading ahead while the presenters spoke. Slide 31, Slide 40, Slide 47. I stopped on Slide 47. It was a chart. Hormonal compound analysis across tested species. The survey I had found at 2 in the morning 3 weeks ago expanded, updated, more data points, the same base finding. The structural cousin compound present in 3 species with partial resonance markers. And humans, still there, still a number in a column, still not highlighted, still not followed up on. The researcher presenting this section. A Veldarin physician named something I was not going to attempt in High Veldarin without preparation, moved through slide 47 in approximately 25 seconds and proceeded to slide 48. I looked at the slide. I thought about Dr. Osai's noodles and her professional skepticism and the word absurd. I thought about 200 years of summits reaching the same conclusion. I raised my hand. There was a pause in the room. Not a long pause, just the specific pause that happens when something occurs that the event organizers had not anticipated and were now calculating the diplomatic cost of addressing. A conclave moderator at the side of the room said, with careful neutrality, that the human cultural liaison representative had a question. The researcher looked at me. Everyone looked at me. I said, in the translation earpieces rendering of High Veldarin, which I had been practicing specifically for this, and which I was told afterward still had a noticeable accent. Has anyone tested this compound in a human subject, in relation to Veldarin resonance compatibility? The silence that followed was of a very particular quality. It was not the silence of a question that made no sense. It was the silence of a question that made a kind of sense that everyone in the room had agreed, without discussing it, never to ask out loud. The senior physician on the research council leaned forward and explained, with great courtesy, that cross-species fertility had not occurred between any 2 conclave species in recorded history. The hormonal resonance required was extraordinarily specific. Evolutionary biology did not produce that kind of compatibility across distinct species lines. It would be, the physician said, like expecting 2 instruments tuned to entirely different scales to accidentally produce harmony. I said, sure, but has anyone actually tried? Someone to my left made a sound, half laugh, half discomfort. Then there were more sounds like it. The particular uncomfortable laughter of a room full of people who found the suggestion absurd and could not quite suppress the absurdity of it. I said, I am serious. I am also volunteering for science. That is what humans do. We try the thing. More laughter. The moderator made a diplomatic calming gesture. The senior physician smiled the way people smile when they want to close a subject gracefully. I looked at the front of the room. I looked at Saravale. She was not laughing. Her bioluminescence was doing something I had never seen it do, not the amusement recognition I had catalogued, not the careful composure, something else entirely. I did not have the word for it yet. The summit moved on. Slides 48 through 200 proceeded without further interruption. The conclusions were thorough, rigorous, and consistent with the previous 3 summits. Afterward, in the corridor outside the conference hall, one of the senior human diplomats found me and advised me, with great patience, never to speak High Veldarin in a public setting again. I thanked him. 20 minutes later, Saravale found me at the end of the same corridor. She said, you volunteered. I said, nobody else was going to. She said it would not work. I said, probably not. She looked at me for a long time. Her bioluminescence was still doing the thing I had no word for. She looked at the corridor wall for a moment, then back at me, and I could see her working through something, the careful, architectural thinking of someone who had been taught to consider every angle of every decision, and was now confronting something that had no angle she had been taught for. She said, Dr. Osai has a laboratory on sublevel 4. Then she walked away. I stood in the corridor. I want to be clear about something. I want to say it plainly so there is no confusion. I did not think it would work. I had read the papers. I had listened to the physician. I understood the word absurd and everything it covered. But I want to be clear about something else. I have a brother. His name was Daniel, and he died before I shipped out, the kind of death that does not make sense in the body, that leaves a shape where something used to be. I came to RIM Station Ocho to stop thinking about Daniel. I came to reorganize cabinets and file reports and exist in a place so far from everything that grief could not find a forwarding address. And what I had learned in 11 months of trying was that grief does not need a forwarding address. It knows where you are. It always knows where you are. So I raised my hand in that room not because I thought it would work, not because I had calculated the odds, not because diplomacy or protocol or career strategy pointed in that direction. I raised my hand because I was tired of sitting in the back of rooms where terrible things were quietly being accepted, and because the woman at the ceremonial table in the front of the room was 31 years old, and her civilization had already written her out of its future, and because I have never once in my life been able to watch something ending without at least trying the thing. That is the human condition. That is the whole of it, honestly. I went to sub-level 4. They reassigned me on a Wednesday. No warning, no explanation beyond standard diplomatic rotation. A form on my datapad, a transport departure in 6 hours, and a handshake from the senior diplomat on station who told me I had done good work and said it with the specific warmth of a man who could not say anything else. I packed my quarters in 11 minutes again, force of habit. I did not see Saravale before I left. She was in a closed delegation session. That was what I was told. I believed it because believing the alternative that she knew and had chosen not to come was a thing I could not organize myself around on 6 hours' notice. Dr. Ose found me at the docking bay with 30 minutes left. She did not say much. She said, "The preliminary results from the analysis will take time. Weeks, maybe more. I will send them when I have them." I said, "Okay." She looked at me in the way she had looked at me when I first brought her the paper, and the question she could not quite decide whether to be impressed or concerned about. "Marcus," she said. "I know," I said. "I don't think you do." "I know," I said again. She nodded, then she left. The transport departed on time. Earth arrived as it always does, like a fact that had been waiting for me to return to it. Chicago in March. Cold in the particular wet way that Chicago is cold, which is different from the cold of space in that space has the decency to be consistent. I took a cab from the transit hub to my apartment. The driver asked if I had been traveling long. I said a little over a year. He said it must be good to be home. I said sure. My apartment was the same. That was the thing about apartments. They hold their shape. The cabinet was where I had left it. The good whiskey I had been saving since before was where I had put it when I stopped drinking it. Everything was in the correct location, and the shape of the place was exactly as I had left it, which meant the shape of everything that was missing from it was also exactly as I had left it. I made coffee. I reorganized the cabinet. I filed my station reports, wrote my transition summary, and submitted my debriefing request within 2 days of arriving, because I am thorough, and because thoroughness is easier than thinking. The Space Corps offered me a promotion in my 4th week back. Senior diplomatic post, Core Systems assignment, real career movement. The kind of offer that makes sense on paper. I said I would think about it. 3 months after I returned, Dr. Ose sent the message. I was sitting at my desk, a regular Tuesday. I had been to the market and back. I had written 2 reports. I had started reading a book I had not been able to finish. The message came through the secure diplomatic channel, flagged personal. I opened it. The first line read, "Marcus, the preliminary results." I closed it. I set the datapad down on the desk. I looked at the wall for a while. Then I made more coffee and did not think about it, which I was still excellent at, and went to bed at a normal hour and slept badly and woke up and reorganized the cabinet and did not open the message again. I went to Daniel's grave that weekend. First time. 11 months after the funeral, I had not been on the same planet to attend. The cemetery was in a suburb I had driven through 100 times without stopping, and I parked the car and walked across wet grass and stood in front of the stone with his name on it and said absolutely nothing for 40 minutes. Then I said, "I don't know what I'm doing," which was the most honest thing I had said since a certain corridor at the end of which a woman had walked away and left me standing with an answer I had not known I was giving. I went back to the car, I drove home, I made dinner. A month later, the Veldaren delegation appeared in Conclave News. A small article, political language, dense and careful, the kind that reveals almost nothing and implies everything. Saravel's name appeared twice. The third paragraph mentioned that the Cathara designation was currently under formal review by the Veldaren High Council. Under review. I read it 4 times. I pulled up the Conclave Cultural Database and searched for the last time a Cathara designation had been placed under formal review. The answer was never. I sat with that for a while. I thought about slide 47. I thought about a woman sitting upright at a ceremonial table in the front of a room, watching herself being accepted as an ending. I thought about bioluminescence doing something I had never seen it do. I thought about a word I had since learned. Velsura. Dr. Osai had used it in a message the following month, a brief follow-up, just 3 lines sent while I was still not opening the first one. She had been studying the Veldaren Emotional Response Lexicon as part of her analysis. She said the word as a footnote. She said it was the Veldaren term for a kind of light, the specific quality of bioluminescence that occurs in response to something unexpected that is also somehow right. The light of the unlooked for. I opened Dr. Osai's first message on a Thursday morning in month 8. I sat in my chair and I read the whole thing, every line, the preliminary findings, the follow-up analysis, the confirmation markers, the second confirmation because Osai was thorough and did not submit findings she had not checked twice, the conclusion, written in the careful language of a scientist who knows she is writing something that will change the shape of everything she is writing about. I read it to the end. Then I opened the cabinet and took out the good whiskey I had been saving since before Daniel, and I stood in his kitchen and laughed about something I cannot remember anymore, and I poured a glass, and I drank it slowly, and I sat in the exact shape of the space that was missing from my apartment and let it be the shape it was. That was the only night I cried. I did not make it a long night. The formal diplomatic communication from the Veldaren Royal House arrived in month 9. It came through the official Space Corps channel, addressed to me personally, marked urgent and eyes only. The document was 700 words of formal Veldaren diplomatic language. I ran it through the translation system 3 times because formal Veldaren is built to carry about 4 times the meaning of the words it uses, and I wanted to be certain I was reading it correctly. 700 words, 43 different formal expressions of diplomatic courtesy, a full section on the weight and honor of the request being made, a subsection on the historical significance of the circumstances, and 4 words near the end that I could read without the translation system. 4 words in plain English, written there deliberately in her handwriting. "Come back, she is here." I looked at the promotion offer sitting on my desk. I looked at the message. A good diplomat measures his responses. A good diplomat considers timing, optics, precedent, the long view. A good diplomat does not make decisions based on 4 words at the end of a 700-word document. I booked the next available transport. I did not deliberate about it. I did not reorganize the cabinet first. I did not pour another glass. I just booked the transport. Daniel would have laughed at me. He would have said something like, "finally," and meant it, which was always how he operated, arriving at the point before I did and waiting there patiently for me to catch up. I locked the apartment. I took the bag I had never fully unpacked. I went back. Veldara was nothing like I had imagined it. I had spent a year alongside Veldarans and read more Veldaran literature and history than most human diplomats encounter in a career. I had an image of the place built from description, from the formal visual representations in diplomatic files, from the way Saravale spoke about it in the rare moments she spoke about it at all. I thought I had a reasonable approximation. I was wrong in every direction that mattered. Veldara was ancient in the way that rearranges your relationship to the word. The cities were not built so much as grown, crystalline structures that rose from the ground in formations that looked organic and were precisely the opposite, engineered over centuries with a mathematical precision that human architects would spend their careers trying to reverse engineer. In sunlight, the whole planet glittered. In the particular blue-white sunlight of the Veldaran star, which was older and cooler than ours, everything shimmered like the surface of deep water. I arrived on a morning that felt nothing like morning. The light was different. The gravity was 93% of Earth standard, which means you feel lighter than you are and your body trusts it after a while, which is disorienting in a way that sneaks up on you. The customs officer at the arrival port looked at my documentation, looked at me, and looked at my documentation again. I was the first human to arrive on Veldara in 30 years. The last one had been a trade envoy for 3 days. Before that, 17 years before that, a cartographer who had gotten the coordinates wrong and apologized extensively. The customs officer said, very carefully in translated standard, purpose of visit. I said personal. He processed that for a moment. Then he stamped my documents with the specific precision of a man who was going to have a very interesting story to tell later and was being professional about it in the meantime. A Veldaran aide in diplomatic gray met me at the exit and escorted me through the arrival complex without speaking. The hallways were high-ceilinged and quiet. Everything smelled of something I could not name, clean and mineral, like stone after rain, but warmer. She met me in a private anteroom off the main diplomatic wing. Not the version of Saravale I had met at the docking bay of Rim Station Acho, formal, silver and white, performing composure as a full-time position. Not the version from the medical summit, sitting at the ceremonial table at the front of a room and watching herself be written out of everything. This was the version from the observation corridor. The one with the slightly looser posture, the questions that arrived without diplomatic scaffolding, the bioluminescence that moved through something that was not quite any of the expressions I had catalogued over a year of paying careful attention. She looked the same. She looked entirely different. The Kethara emblem was not at her collarbone. I noticed that immediately. I said, "You could have told me." She said, "You would have stayed." I said, "Yes." She said, "I needed to know you came back for the right reason." I stood there for a moment. 14 steps of diplomatic protocol. The whole architecture of formal greeting and measured response and calibrated language. None of it arrived. I said, "How is she?" Saravale's bioluminescence, gold and warm, and doing the thing I now had a word for, brightened slightly. She said, "Come and see." The room they took me to cost more per square foot than my Chicago apartment. It was warm in a way. The rest of the building was not temperature-controlled precisely, the kind of careful environment that represents every resource a civilization can devote to a single point of focus. A team of 3 Veldaran physicians was stationed outside the door. They looked at me with expressions I would describe as scientifically fascinated and personally uncertain in equal measure. Inside the room, she was asleep. I am not going to try to describe that moment in any way that does it justice. Some things resist language, and that moment is one of them. I will say only what was true. She was small, Half human, half Veldarin, biologically improbable and politically consequential, and currently asleep in a way that reduced all of that to complete irrelevance. Her bioluminescence was faint, not the steady glow of a Veldarin adult, but something intermittent, like a light learning to find its rhythm. The medical team had described this in the documents Dr. Osai forwarded. Not a malfunction, not a concern, an adaptation. A system that had never existed before, building itself from two different blueprints, finding a middle path. Her fingers were longer than a human infant's, not dramatically, just enough to notice. When I held out my hand and her fingers closed around my thumb, it was with a grip that seemed entirely too certain for something that had existed for 9 months and been in the world for 6 weeks. I stood there for a while. Saravel stood beside me and did not speak and did not need to. I said eventually, very quietly, "She needs a name." Saravel said she had a Veldarin ceremonial designation, 43 syllables, formally registered with the High Council, ancient lineage rooted in it. I said, "What do we call her at breakfast?" Saravel looked at me. Her expression did something I had not seen before, something past Velsura, past recognition, past the careful, considered language of a woman who had spent her life in a culture where every expression carried formal weight. Something simpler than all of that. She said, "You choose." The conclave, as it turned out, was having significant feelings about all of this. I was briefed on the diplomatic situation by a senior Space Corps official who arrived on Veldara 2 days after I did, slightly out of breath, with the expression of a man who had been handed a situation that had not been covered in any training module he had ever encountered. 17 formal objections had been filed with the conclave assembly. 2 species were demanding full genetic verification before recognizing any diplomatic implications. 1 species had convened an emergency theological council. 1 very small species on the outer rim had declared the whole thing a miracle and started a religious movement around it, which the senior official described as a complication in the tone of a man trying very hard not to say something less diplomatic. The Veldarin High Council had convened 3 times in 6 weeks. The Cathara designation had not just been placed under review, it had been formally suspended, pending a council ruling that everyone understood had already been made, but required the full ceremonial process before it could be stated. A research team of 12 xenobiologists, 4 geneticists, and 2 medical ethicists had been formed. Dr. Osa had been appointed to co-lead it. She sent me a message that said simply, "You owe me a very good dinner." I sent back, "Name the planet." I was asked by the senior official to address the conclave assembly in a formal session. He asked if I needed time to prepare remarks. I said I did not. The conclave assembly chamber on the conclave station was designed to seat representatives of 42 species simultaneously. It was built for the scale of things that matter to civilizations, treaties, crises, the formal language of consequences. I stood at the human representatives' podium and looked out at 42 species and the particular weight of history that had been placed on a Tuesday in the back row of a medical summit when a human diplomat raised his hand. I said 4 things. I said, "We are not the oldest species in this room, or the strongest, or the most advanced." I said, "We have no particular genius for biology or genetics, or the architecture of living things." I said, "What we have is a specific and probably irrational refusal to accept conclusions before we have tried the thing that everyone else agreed was not worth trying." And then I said, "I raised my hand. The universe said yes. I suggest the rest of you start raising your hands more." The assembly was quiet for a moment. Then the species that had started the religious movement began a sound that their translator rendered as sustained approval, and several other species followed, and the senior official standing at the side of the room put his face briefly in his hands and then composed himself, because he was a professional. I went back to Vildura. There were months of documentation ahead. Research processes, diplomatic negotiations, the elaborate formal work of mapping a thing that had never existed before onto the structures that civilizations use to hold things in place. I filed more forms in the next 4 months than I had filed in my previous 4 years combined. I also learned to read Veldaren. The real version, not Confidensstadler High Veldaren, but the daily language, the warm language, the language Saravale used when the formal weight was off and she was just talking. She taught me in the mornings, in the room with the warm temperature controls, while the baby slept between us and the Veldaren sunlight came through the crystalline walls at a blue-white angle that made everything look like the inside of something beautiful. She would correct my pronunciation, and I would mispronounce the same word 3 more times, because the sounds were genuinely difficult, and also because I had discovered that Saravale's bioluminescence did the Velsora thing when I mispronounced, and then corrected, and I was not above using this information. She caught on eventually. She said, "You are doing that on purpose." I said, "I have no idea what you mean." She gave me the look, then the Velsora, then she went back to the lesson. We named the baby on a Thursday. Not a ceremonial Thursday, not a planned Thursday, a Thursday where I was sitting with the baby in the warm room and she was awake and looking at me with the calm, ancient, slightly accusatory focus that newborns direct at the world, and I said the name out loud, just to hear it. Danielle. Saravale heard it from the doorway where she had appeared silently, which she did often, being a person who moved through spaces without announcing herself. She looked at me. She looked at the baby. She said, "Who is Daniel?" I looked at the baby for a moment. Then I said, "My brother. He died before I shipped out. The kind of death that leaves a shape." Saravale was quiet. Then she crossed the room and sat beside me and looked at the baby whose faint bioluminescence was learning its rhythm, and she said, "Danielle." I said, "Yes." She said nothing else. She did not need to. Some things do not require the architecture of explanation. The 43-syllable Veldaren designation remained, formally registered, ancient and correct and necessary for the ceremonial record. But we called her Danielle at breakfast, and at lunch, and at dinner, and in the early mornings when she decided that 2 in the morning was a reasonable time to be awake and interested in things, which was constant and exhausting and the best thing that had ever happened to me. She did not look like Daniel. That would have been too much to ask, biologically improbable in a way that even the xenobiologists would have struggled to explain. But she had his ears. I noticed it in the 3rd week, and I did not say anything about it for a long time because I was not sure what to do with it. Dr. Osai, when she visited in month 4, looked at the baby and then looked at me and said, "Her ears." I said, "I know." She said, "That is going to be in every paper we publish." I said, "I know." She looked at Saravale, who was across the room and had probably heard all of it. Then she looked back at me and said, "You did the thing." I said, "We did the thing." She nodded. Then she went to meet the baby because she was human and humans reach for things. It is what we do. I stood in a crystalline city at the edge of a world that had not expected me, under a blue-white sun that made everything shimmer like deep water, and I held a small and biologically improbable person who was learning to glow, and I thought about Daniel standing in his kitchen laughing about something I cannot remember anymore, and I thought about a posting letter on a Tuesday that buried my career with full honors. And I thought about the back row of a medical summit where a human diplomat raised his hand, and the universe said yes. We are not the strongest. We are not the oldest. We are not the most patient or the most advanced or the most feared. We are the ones who try the thing when the room has already decided the thing cannot be done. We have always been those people. We always will be. I raised my hand. That is the whole story. Everything else is just what happened after.